Hello, with me today I have Dr. Claire Taylor, who is a lecturer in medieval history in the Department of History. 800 years ago, an event took place, the Fourth Lateran Council, which had profound impact on Western Christianity. And with me to discuss the significance of that, and it's 800 years ago in 815 to 2015, is Claire. Claire, you're very welcome.
Thank you.
Why is a church council of 800 years ago significant historically?
It was a council at which various issues that had been that Christians had been talking about for centuries sort of crystallized and came together. It's extremely important also, not just for what the council did, but because it was the action of Pope Innocent III, who was Pope from 1198, and so well into his pontificate he organised this council to address various issues, and he was one of the popes who we could say really is the most significant pope of the Middle Ages, I would argue, certainly one of the most significant. He was responsible for organising 3 crusades, for example, so he was very active in himself, but this was possibly the most significant thing that he did.
Why is it called the Lateran Council rather than just the Roman Council?
It took place in the Lateran Palace, so which predates the Vatican Palace. So it's like saying the Vatican Councils now, but it was in the Lateran Palace. That's why they called it that.
Innocent III is one of those fascinating figures because he's one of the great lawyer popes, but he's also the person who takes credit for being the one who authorises the Franciscan movement to start off.
That's right.
But why, so a great lawyer pope, involved with the Crusades, involved with the Franciscan and the Mendicant movement, why of all these things is the Council of 1215 his greatest, his biggest event?
Well, from the perspective of studying medieval religiosity and heresy, there were 2 really key things going on here. One of them was that he addressed the whole issue of Christian belief and practice around the Eucharist. So the Fourth Lateran really codifies the idea or the understanding, the theology of transubstantiation. So that deals with a kind of belief aspect, if you like. It decides Christians believe this. But at the same time, it codified what Christians should do in relation to that. So it became important for Christians to go to Mass and receive the Eucharist once a year, for example. So it was a kind of interrelated process of belief and practice that meant that you were a Christian, you were part of the Christian community.
And that would be something that would surprise many Christians today, for whom the idea of going to the Eucharist far more frequently is common. But actually, the Lateran Council actually had to make it mandatory that you would go at least once a year to the Eucharist.
That's right.
What does that tell us about attitudes to religiosity to which the council was reacting?
Well, you're quite right. The fact that this was a minimum that was set down, does show us that really a lot of people's relationship with the church was quite distant. We have a process in this period, I think, of not just of heresy, of opposition to the church and opposition to doctrines like transubstantiation, but a huge range of what we can call unbelief. A historian of heresy called John Arnold, who works at Birkbeck, he's done a lot of work in this area, sort of pointing out that we don't need to think about the opposites of orthodoxy and heresy. What we have is a huge range of belief, and it was very common within that range for people to not really know about the Eucharist, but also to believe different things about it, and very much critique the idea that it literally was Christ's body and blood. There was a whole sort of series of jokes about this, where people would say, if this is the body and blood of Christ, he must have been as big as a mountain, for example. So this sort of scepticism, if you like.
And so you're seeing the Fourth Lateran Council as Innocent wanting to make everything organised and standardised. He's a man who has a great interest in uniformity.
He does, and at the same time, the other very important thing that happens is the settling of the Albigensian Crusade. The settlement he tries to bring about will mean that sort of the Christian or the Crusaders from northern France, who had been successful in southern France in taking territories off people who supported heretics or people who objected to the northern French invasion of southern France in some way. He sort of codified the idea or established the idea that lands that had been taken off them could be kept by Crusaders. They weren't just being chastised, they were actually losing all their property.
So one of the effective mechanisms that Innocent puts forward is if you support his religious policy, you get on side the military power and the political power because there are benefits to them. And so it actually gels, to use the jargon of church-state, it gels the church-state power nexus very efficiently.
It does, but at the same time it's very controversial. I mean, one of the things that he does is to rule not only that the land of Count Raymond VI of Toulouse would be forfeit to the Crusaders, but also that Count Raymond's son could not inherit that land. And this was very controversial. In fact, we've sources describing the churchmen from southern France pursuing the Pope into the garden at at the Lateran Palace to force him to agree to this, because the idea that the sons of the father can be revisited on, the sins of the father can be revisited on the son was something that didn't sit easily with the Pope. But in the end, that's what he did.
So in other words, he supports the civil arm because the civil arm will support him. And actually, there's good political reasons for being anti-heresy and being pro his vision of the Eucharist.
Definitely. I mean, I think pragmatism is one thing that characterises this Pope, but in a way that is far less cynical than you can point to perhaps with other church leaders. He had a very, very clear theological vision and understood very clearly what his role in the Christian community was.
How did he see that role?
He saw himself and managed to achieve this for himself as being above the secular authorities as well as at the head of the church, and managed to establish what historians have come to call the papal monarchy, whereby the process whereby emperors and kings would be continually arguing on a theoretical basis that their power ought to be independent to some degree from the papacy. Because, as you say, he was this great lawyer pope, he managed to reconcile all of this in his favour, that he was the top Christian, whether in the church or otherwise.
He has the move from Vicar of St. Peter, Vicarius Sancti Petri, to Vicarius Christi, Vicar of Christ. Has taken place, but it receives further elaboration with Innocent.
That's right. He very much sees himself as Vicar of Christ in the context of being not just a representative of Christ, but the representative of Christ. Yeah.
And he sees that very much in feudal terms, just as the local châtelaine is the representative and has all the powers of the more distant ruler. He sees himself as actually being Christ in the locality.
Absolutely, and in very literal terms as well, because he received the homage of kings, for example, John of England, for the kingdom. So he was overlord of England itself.
And he's then able to use that, of course, to produce the idea that he has that his law is a better law and a more universal law. And I remember Richard Southern did a graph of appeals to the papal court, and you see that during his time the amount of people running to Rome for justice just shoots up.
Yes, yeah. This is because of his role as a lawyer pope and a very efficient bureaucrat. The administrative, the 12th century anyway saw an improvement in administrative processes with every rulers, and very much so with the papal chancery. We have very systematic organising of the records, and so we can see this sort of flourishing in appeals and the growth of legislation. But it's not just that we know it grew; we knew it was being preserved. The paperwork was being preserved properly, which is really quite a new thing.
So, this event of 800 years ago and the Pope that inspired Lateran IV, we're seeing a growth in the theory of papacy, a whole series of growths in theology, whereby what's a very almost obscure theory in the 12th century, transubstantiation, is made into something that's terribly central, but also it's having practical implications not only for Christians at that time, but indeed for many Christians subsequently.
Absolutely, yeah. The legacy of the Fourth Lateran is huge. It shapes the later Middle Ages very much.
Claire, thank you very much.
Thank you.